Brought to us this morning. And first I would like to ask Dr. Rita Pratt to come up to the stage. She is with us from the Bahamas, and she has been working very hard in the Bahamas to help uncover and elevate the story of the Underground Railroad there. So she brings greetings from the Bahamas.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
It's so happy to be here among you all and to make that bond between the African American and the Bahamas, the diaspora, the African diaspora bond. And I was looking for Queen Quet, and I want to give her accolades this morning because it wouldn't have been possible for me to be here today or for the young man from Red Bay Andres because of Queen Quet inviting me to South Carolina, to the Fixico, to make a connection with the glass door. And it was at her, it was at Queen's Quet festival that I met Barbara Taggart from the National Park Service. And history was made at that time for the Bahamas and the National Park Service. And I really wanted to give for you all to give her a round of applause, but she is not here. But as far as yes, but as far as the Underground Railroad between the Bahamas and America, the Underground Railroad in the Bahamas is awesome. I would like for a session of the Underground Railroad to be held in the Bahamas. And not just Red Bay Andres, we have the black preachers and black Baptists in the Bahamas was a runaway priest. A runaway Baptist minister by the name of Prince William. And today, he is responsible for over 60,000 Bahamians becoming Baptists in the Bahamas. And the Baptist denomination is the largest denomination in the Bahamas. And I just uncovered a slave ship that came to the Bahamas with 134 African Americans. And the Bahamian people was a part of freeing, liberating those 134 African Americans from that slave ship. So I could just go on and on, but there is a bond, Underground Railroad bond between the Bahamas and America. And I'm most grateful to be a part of this Underground Railroad conference. And I bring greetings from all those prospective Underground Railroad sites in the Bahamas.
Is Dr. Bettye Gardner here? There she is. One of the partners that we have been working with from the National Park Service Underground Railroad program is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And it's become quite a beautiful partnership, and Dr. Gardner is bringing greetings from that organization.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm pleased to be here myself and to bring greetings on behalf of the President and the Executive Council of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I would like to extend an invitation to all of you to join us the end of September, I think it is, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for our annual conference. If you've not been, you should begin to go, because as we move toward 2015, which will be our centennial of the association, we have a number of interesting programs planned. Next year we will be in Jacksonville, Florida. So those of you who were here for the tour yesterday will have to come back. I'm sure there'll be even more to see by next year. I'd also like to ask that any other members of the association would please stand. I know I've seen many of you here, so would you please stand? Thank you. We're pleased to be a sponsor and look forward to the next 2 days, or 3 days.
Okay, at this point, I would like to ask one of the descendant representatives that we brought to the conference, who spoke briefly to you last night, to come up to introduce our keynote speaker. So, Mr. Fixico.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you, one and all.
Good morning. Good morning.
When I began reading Black Indians by Mr. William Loren Katz, I was an African American. When I finished, I was an African Native American, as described by the Smithsonian Institution's Indivisible Book and Exhibit. This process has been repeated by millions of others throughout the world. For this reason, I call Mr. Bill Katz the father of Black Indian Studies in America. I'd like to welcome Mr. Bill Katz. Give him a great welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm honored to be here. This is the culmination of a long, long life devoted to this topic. And I'm honored to come here and honor you, especially the descendants of the first freedom fighters of the North and South American continents and the islands of the Caribbean. You represent an American tradition that is both older and more meaningful than the first Thanksgiving. It represents what we could have been much, much earlier. It represents the best in us, regardless of what color or religion we are. And so I'm here to really honor you. What I want to do, I'm going to be showing some pictures soon, but first I want to pause and thank some of the people who made this possible, my being here and your being here. Our commanders, Diane Miller and Dr. Lowe, and all of the National Park Service. My dear friend, Phil Fixico, represents the indomitable Maroon spirit and has aided me immeasurably since we met. And by the way, the two of us are going to be reaching out to media and other places as a joint act. We're going to go before people who are interested in this story from both the point of view of descendants and the point of view of the history, whether it's through the media or colleges or museums and so on. I also have to thank Chief Osceola Townsend of the Bettye Nation, who guided me since 1986 and inducted me into his National Alliance of Native Americans. Kevin Mulroy, whose scholarly brilliance I've often been able to feast on and could not speak today. Lonnie Moonfire Harrington, with whom I shared many a platform and important exchanges. And one of my recent friends, William Dove Warrior, who is a fountainhead of perfect and valuable information. I keep learning from him. I also need to thank Professor Heriberto Dixon, who has flooded me with important articles and spent endless hours fielding my questions on the telephone. And, of course, I have to reach back to those like Kenneth Wiggins Porter, who pioneered research in the 1920s on this topic. Nobody was listening, and his warm friendship inspired me since the 1960s, and I was honored to bring out his book of essays back in 1968. And Mrs. Annette Porter, his charming wife, who made me curator of Professor Porter's papers, which I speedily donated to the Schomburg Library, and they've spread out from there to many people here. Oh, I see we're showing some of the pictures now. These will be going on, and by the way, I will just make one other announcement. I am negotiating to also give a PowerPoint presentation with 50 rare pictures that I brought from my collection, and I presume it'll be announced as soon as the time and place is set. I think you'll find those fascinating. And finally, I wish to thank somebody I have not thanked enough, and it's Dr. Lori Lehman of Long Island University, who put up with my devotion to this subject since 1983, when she edited the first Black Indians, and then agreed to marry me, so this meant listening even more. And here she is again, still listening. And another person who could not be here, our good friend George Circling Eagle Tooks, African Apache, a dear friend, keeper of the flame, and the best man at our wedding. I first want to say a few words before I get to the history of what a struggle it was to get this story out. A small band of historians that started with Black Seminole, Rosa Fay, and Kenneth Wiggins Porter dared to tell a story that flew in the faces of powerful people and an accepted American narrative. They pried open the door for scholars like me and many others, and for people at this conference to speak truth to power. Let me give a couple of trenchant examples of what it meant to get this story out way back then in Porter's time. In 1774, James Madison, patriot, father of the Constitution, President of the United States, and a Virginia slaveholder, wrote of a slave revolt, quote, "It is prudent that all such attempts be concealed as well as suppressed." And we then lived in centuries, not only in which slave rebellions for freedom were suppressed, but news about them was concealed. We did not learn about some of our glorious freedom fighters. We all know that Lake Okeechobee was one of the greatest Native American defeats of the U.S. Army. But Colonel Zachary Taylor claimed victory, was made a general, and went on to win the presidency as an Indian fighter. When President Taylor died in office in 1850, a young former congressman memorialized him at Chicago City Hall. Quote, "He was never beaten. In 1737, he fought and conquered in the memorable Battle of Lake Okeechobee, one of the most desperate struggles known to the annals of Indian warfare." End quote. I sadly report to you that the speaker was Abraham Lincoln. In his Almanac of American History, the famous Harvard scholar Arthur Schlesinger Jr., historian to President Kennedy, simply proclaimed Taylor victorious in 1837. Quote, "Fighting in the Second Seminole War, General Zachary Taylor defeats a group of Seminoles at Lake Okeechobee Swamp, Florida." End quote. So the story of the Southern Underground Railroad and other daring forms of resistance were never told. White abolitionists did not tell it, for they had been driven from the southern states by the slave power. An entrenched slave system permitted no challenges to disturbances. I found out personally how the lie continued in 1950 when I gained my degree in history from Syracuse University thanks to the GI Bill. I had to suffer through a course on the Civil War and Reconstruction period that wept for the poor white supremacists. When I wrote an admiring book report on W.E.B. Du Bois' brilliant Black Reconstruction, my professor wrote a 4-letter word on top: NUS. One of his final examination questions, and I please ask you to trust my memory, was, quote, "Justify the actions of the Ku Klux Klan," end quote. I completed my master's at NYU in 1951 because I could not afford a graduate degree at Columbia University, but I could trundle up to Columbia to sit in on a course on slavery. And one day I did. The class had about 80 or 90 students with one male student of color. It was taught by a young, handsome, red-haired, young white Southerner. His was a slaveholder's story. He said with charm and caustic humor, "We didn't whoop nobody," end quote. And that's not all. Toward the end of this class, the back door opened, and 2 of his students carried in a huge flatbed birthday cake for their professor. It was his birthday. It had candles and a gray icing because it was in the form of a Confederate flag. What I'd like to do now is gather up my notes correctly here for a moment. And I usually talk extemporaneously, but I thought this was too important an occasion to trust in my memory. The Southern Underground Railroad was unique compared to others that flowed northward and cannot be described even in the same terms. First, it had no white people to help, and then write its daring, and no people of color could take the time to write it. It did not have even uncomfortable stations that provided shelter and food. It lacked a John Brown, who headed south to lead people further south, or Harriet Tubman or a William Wells Brown. It had no Levi Coffin in Indiana or Ohio ready to help, and no William Still in Philadelphia to welcome escapees, no Joseph Brant in Canada with his Mohawks to help, no Frederick Douglass in Rochester take in with a weary. It did have people, it did have leaders, such as Menendez, with names like Menendez, Garcia, Kawakachi, Anacawana, and names unknown except to the loved ones and those they rescued. And it operated from Texas and Oklahoma westward to Florida, southward into Mexico, and to the islands of the Caribbean. We have rare pieces of its many battles in mysterious ways and how it united indigenous people, Hispanic Americans, and Africans into our first Rainbow Coalition on our first freedom fighters. Some say it began with Anacawana, a beloved Taino poet and performer who brought gifts to Columbus and his crew when they landed in Haiti. She learned fast, fought hard, but was soon captured and executed. Or was it Atué, who died exactly 500 years ago, this February 2nd, who first rose against the European invaders with 600 Taino and African followers, and then took them in boats, paddled to Cuba to warn about the invaders. He made the struggle both transnational and Pan-American. It was the courage of Anacawana and Atué that guided Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas into a lifelong defense of indigenous people and combat against slavery. In Florida, an African Seminole Alliance was without precedent in the United States. Africans who fled slavery in the British colonies were among the first explorers of Florida. When the Seminole Nation arrived around 1776, the Africans taught them methods of rice cultivation they had learned in Senegambia and Sierra Leone, Africa, and a multicultural nation was constructed as an agricultural and military alliance. Africans rose to leadership, and the two peoples united against slavery and U.S. domination. Writing of African Seminole encampments along the Apalachicola River in 1816, U.S. Army Colonel Clinch said, "The American Negroes had principally settled along the river, and a number of them had left their fields and gone over to the Seminoles on hearing of our approach. Their cornfields extended nearly 50 miles up the river, and their numbers were daily increasing." 50 miles, you had black and red plantations. Clinch found black and Seminole farmers raised crops, cattle, horses, traded with neighbors, brought up their children. This Florida beacon of hope stirred a war lasting 2 generations. The Black Seminole Alliance was the largest and longest slavery rebellion in U.S. history, the strongest Southern network of the Underground Railroad, and the first great Rainbow Coalition. No wonder it struck fear in the hearts of U.S. slaveholders. It found allies among the Spanish, established international connections into the Caribbean and Mexico, and was never defeated. This alliance fought the United States to a standstill in 3 Seminole wars, running circles around the best trained army in the Americas and causing a U.S. expenditure of $30 million and a loss of 1,500 soldiers in one humiliating defeat after another. One cannot understand the history of Florida without understanding this branch of the Underground Railroad. Sometimes the Underground Railroad refused to move. You know, we always think of it in motion. Sometimes it refused to move. In November 1861, the Union fleet captured the Georgia and South Carolina Sea Islands, and General Rufus Saxton reported what happened when the slaveholders tried to take their slaves further south. Quote, "They tried to take their Negroes with them, but they would not go. They shot down their Negroes in many instances because they would not go with them. They tied them behind wagons and tried to drag them off, but the Negroes would not go. The majority of Negroes, 80%, remained behind and came into our lines. One of the people that I met that came from the Sea Islands and from that tradition was a wonderful woman named Dr. Sarah Dunlap Jackson, who worked at the National Archives, the only black person for many decades to work at the National Archives. It was an enormous help and one of my great mentors. Sometimes the Underground Railroad was a wild scramble to safety. In March 1862, General Burnside reported from New Bern, North Carolina, quote, "They find their way to us through the woods and swamps from every side and are wild with excitement." Sometimes it was a flight turned into a battle. In early 1862, black militia units in Florida, Confederate General Floyd complained, so harassed the Confederates, he demanded, quote, "as a measure of absolute necessity," end quote, that Governor Milton declare martial law in 6 counties. In May that year in Pensacola, Confederate Commander Thomas Jones reported the greatest trouble he was having were that freed slaves were giving valuable information to the Union forces. Sometimes rescues and the Underground moved by water. In Georgia, a woman put her 22 children and grandchildren on a raft and floated them to freedom with them. On the evening of May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls, the slave pilot of a Confederate gunboat called the Planter, planned a mass escape. When his white officers left the Planter, Smalls and his African-American crew hurried their families aboard and sailed into Charleston Harbor, blinked the correct signal to the Confederate batteries at 4 a.m., and then handed the ship to the Union Navy. Smalls said, quote, "I thought the Planter might be of some use to Uncle Abe," end quote. He was the first human being to steal a battleship. And through the war, he served the Union as its captain. Sometimes the Southern Underground Railroad was an organized flight of thousands from the Indian Territory. When Creek leaders signed on with the Confederacy under compulsion in 1861, Opatla Yahola, a wealthy Creek landowner with many slaves, mind you, was convinced most indigenous people, as well as the slaves, wanted nothing to do with the Confederacy or war. Yahola soon found he was far from alone. By fall, thousands of men, women, and children from Creek, Seminole, and other nations, including many African Americans, had gathered at locations in the Indian Territory. They wanted no part of the Confederate war. In time, half the Seminole Nation, many Cherokee, Creek, also Chickasaw, Choctaw, Kickapoo, Shawnee, Delaware, and Comanche, found their way to Yahola's ranch in northeastern Oklahoma. They rejected alignment with the federal government they found untrustworthy and a confederacy fighting to preserve slavery. Hoping President Lincoln would provide military protection, Yahola wrote to him saying, "Now the wolf has come. Men who are strangers tread our soil. Our children are frightened and mothers cannot sleep for fear," end quote. Lincoln supported their neutrality and promised help. But federal forces were busy in the East fighting a war, and this proved an empty gesture. Yahola's thousands circled around to recruit other neutral Africans and Indians. They were repeatedly attacked by Confederate cavalry and infantry. But in one attack, 300 Confederate Cherokee soldiers deserted, some to go home and some to join the resistance. The day after Christmas, Yahola's exodus was defeated on a battlefield. Bloodied and beaten men and women and children fled into the winter cold. They abandoned wagons, bedding, and clothing and lost about 900 cattle, 250 ponies, and 190 sheep as they struggled through a blizzard. The dead lay on the frozen ground and were devoured by wolves. Said one Seminole, "At that battle we lost everything we possessed. Everything to take care of our women and children with. All that we had, we left them in cold blood by the wayside." But the survivors finally reached Kansas. In April 1862, as the first buds of spring poked through the soil, 7,600 were receiving U.S. Army supplies, and the young men, especially those of African descent, talked not of neutrality, but of fighting to free enslaved relatives. What began as a peaceful march from the Indian Territory made seasoned soldiers of the Civil War's first African American and Black Indian troops to face the enemy. A total of 20,000 Native Americans and Africans fled the Indian Territory to avoid serving the Confederacy. That was an Underground Railroad. This Underground Railroad soon became liberators. Historian Mark Louse reports that the men of the 1st Indian Home Guard, 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored Regiments fought in Missouri, Arkansas, and the Indian Territory. They killed slaveholders and freed enslaved family members and perfect strangers before the Emancipation Proclamation. They became part of the 200,000 and more soldiers of color. President Lincoln said, quote, "with silent tongue and clenched teeth and a steady eye and well-poised bayonet helped mankind," end quote. From Virginia to Florida to Texas, the Southern Underground Railroad made history. Black journalist Morris Chester of the Philadelphia Press wrote at the time, quote, "The Underground Railroad from Richmond seems to be thoroughly repaired and is not only in running condition, but is doing an increasing business. We have had an arrival from Richmond every day, sometimes 2 or 3 in the 24 hours, end quote. Some were there to help General Sherman and his 60,000 troops live off the land as they sliced into the southern states towards Savannah. One of those liberated by Sherman was the ancestor of a Black Indian woman named Michelle, whose children now play on the White House lawn. In early March 1865, Sherman finally reaches the southern border of North Carolina in a torrential rainstorm. Here he's cut off, and he's essentially blinded. He can't move forward. Suddenly, a dark, grizzled, shabby guerrilla force he called Lumbees appears. They're actually a mixture of the original English colonies of Roanoke of 1685, the famous lost colony, who had married people of the Lumbee Nation and people of African descent. They called themselves the Lowry Band, after their mixed-race leader, Henry Berry Lowry. And lo and behold, they guided General Sherman through the muddy roads and swollen creeks of Robeson County. Sherman called it the damnedest marching I ever saw. Sherman had stumbled on a triracial band that had been fighting the Confederate Home Guards in a miniature civil war. Sherman continued on, and the Lowry Band remained to fight the Ku Klux Klan after the war. A century later, descendants of the Lowry Band into the election time of Barack Obama were still producing and acting in an outdoor play, Strike the Wind, with musical numbers by Willie French Lowry, that over its many performances over many years had 1,000 actors depicting their intrepid ancestors who fought the Confederacy and the Klan. The Southern Underground Railroad was more than the damnedest marching anyone ever saw, because its enemies saw it not as a peaceful strike for liberty, a search for family and peace, but a defiant military movement. Its casualty rates were high compared to those lines heading northward. It operated entirely in enemy territory, where any white person would be rewarded for reporting or fighting it, and its armies were arrayed against it. Both fearful and fearless, it was sometimes well organized and armed, at other times a chaotic, unarmed dash to freedom that looked like a slave revolt on the move. It could expect no sympathy, refuge, or help. It had to hide at all times, live off the land, and advance as swiftly as its slowest feet could move. When one measures its courage, conviction, and incredible success against these obstacles, we find a new set of American heroes. It was the damnedest marching anyone ever saw, a lethal mix of slave rebellion, mass exodus to freedom, and pure American guts and courage. And in its various efforts, it probably saved more men, women, and children than all the efforts heading north. Thank you. Yes,
5 minutes.
Yeah, I've been told we have about 5 minutes if any of you have questions. Didn't mean to scare everybody with all that information. I guess historians can be a little scary at times. Yes, sir.
Just a comment, Mr. Katz. When you mentioned Robert Smalls, the pilot of the boat Planter, Robert Smalls was also a man of Gullah ancestry. So we have that connection as well. We have a connection to our people here, one of their ancestors.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And he also became a very important congressman after the Civil War from South Carolina. Yes, back there. Please stand.
I'm Wallace Tinney from the Florida Black Historical Research Project. I was wondering, I noticed you were giving accolades to Kenneth Porter. What about The Exiles of Florida by Joshua Giddings? Do you have The Exiles of Florida by Joshua Giddings?
Okay. Okay. Your question is a good one. Joshua Giddings wrote The Exiles of Florida. I have to tell you that it's not always a reliable source. He wrote it back, when he was in Congress, serving from Ohio. And it was a noble effort to bestow the heroic mantle on the Seminole people and their black allies, and it was valuable in that way. By the way, if I could just add this, I had that book reprinted for the first time since it had come out in, I think, the 1830s or 1840s, in a huge reprint effort I did for the New York Times. And the only other book that we could find that had to do with the southern branch of the Underground Railroad, particularly the Gullah people, was Lorenzo Dow Turner's Africanisms in the Gullah dialect. I was able, and my committee, I had a committee of 10 leading historians, of which only James M. McPherson was the only other white man. We had the Schomburg Library, the library at Howard University, and so on. We found dozens of books on the Underground Railroad, including books by names of people I read, Frederick Douglass, but all of the people throughout the Midwest and so on. But we could find hardly anything, and that's why this conference is so important. It is finally shining the light and bringing out the truth of really what had to be the most incredibly brave segment of the Underground Railroad that any place ever knew. Thank you. So
what does the Spanish contribution to the Underground Railroad and the relationship to the African Native Americans?
There was constant intermixing and protection. One of the stories that first of all, Florida was a safe haven because Spain claimed it. And being a European nation, you couldn't just do anything. One of the stories I like, I think it goes back to the late 1500s, was a group of English masters came down to St. Augustine to get their slaves back. They were going to capture them. And there they were, I think it was three men. And the slaveholders looked at them And the slaves looked back and they stuck their tongues out at them. It was Spain and the Spanish people gave that kind of strength to the movement. That's just one example. You also had people like Lucy Gonzalez Parsons, who probably never heard of. She never graced any of our history books. She was born a slave in Texas and became free, and she became a leading feminist, radical socialist, and spokesman for the oppressed of the world, known on a world scale. So it allowed the people like this to come out and to survive and to make their contribution. I could go on with it, but I think I have time for probably one more question. Someone back there. Yes.
I know Benjamin Lundy started a fugitive slave community down, well, it was Mexico at the time, but I think that part of Mexico actually became part of Texas.
Yes.
Whatever happened to the fugitive slaves that were down there, do you know? The ones that Lundy helped?
Yeah, no, I know he tried to start that colony and had a whole big plan. I don't know how far that it got. I don't think, I mean, given the strength of the slave power in Texas, could have gotten very far. I mean, even the poor German Americans who lived up in the hill country, President Lyndon Johnson came from, they had to be very careful, and they were silenced. The anti-slavery people, the white people who were anti-slavery, were driven from places like Texas, or they just had to make believe that they didn't think that way anymore.
Another comment.
I would like to comment about how we travel from South Carolina, since I am a refugee out of South Carolina, to Florida and other places. I have a Batused boat at my museum in Paulus, and this family has been building boats, Gulf family, for over 250 years. And I think that a lot of us travel from South Carolina because we were great boat builders. And we knew the waterways, the creeks, the animals, and so forth. So I'm quite sure that when you start studying, instead of a lot of times when heading north, you know, they use the wagon, but what we did, I think we traveled by boat.
Great, thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments? I wanted to thank Dr. Katz, or Mr. Katz again, and give him a round of applause.
I want to thank you for being here and for listening to this long suppressed series of truths. And hopefully you, like my friend Phil Pompey, Fixico, and so many others, will carry this message out of here and say that the first freedom fighters were here. They didn't look like Patrick Henry, they didn't look like Benjamin Franklin, they didn't put on white wigs in 1776 and write magnificent words, and they were magnificent words, but they acted on it. They acted on it every moment of their lives. Thank you.
Well, I have another distinguished guest that I wanted to bring up to speak with you for a moment. Mr. Tony Hill, who is formerly a state senator in Florida and now works for Mayor Alton Brown in Jacksonville, would like to bring greetings.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh, y'all can do better than that. Good morning. Good morning. There's about 3 state troopers trying to get over here to see y'all. Can't use that. I'm in the legislature anymore. I was going to Tallahassee. Tallahassee was going 10 west. I was coming, you know, south here, so I couldn't use that. But I wanted just to welcome you to the conference. Diane has been working on this, and they were over in Jacksonville yesterday and had a lunch. How many people came over to Jacksonville yesterday and had a lunch? Great. Great. Is Representative Clark in the house? I guess he's going to be coming a little later there. But I just wanted to bring you greetings and welcome you. We keep hearing about the Gully Geechee. I just want to let y'all know that the mayor of Jacksonville is Gully Geechee. Adam Brown. Hello. And he maybe came by boat. But it's so good to see you, and I hope that in your deliberations that you continue to keep leading the way and paving the way, that our young people will recognize and pick up our history and go on down the road and realize that what happened doesn't matter where we come from, it's where we're going. And that, but we need to at least know where we came from in order to keep going and not give up. It reminds me of a story that I'm going to get out of your way, because you have some great workshops. Because one thing I've learned about being around Diane and some of the rest of them is that I see Sister Plackey on the front row, Miss Bahamas. Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh yes, in the house. And, it reminds me of a story. I was in Cleveland maybe about 10 years ago, and I went to retrieve my ticket to come back to Jacksonville. And Dr. Jackson, they said to the kiosk next to it, said, I can tell you your name, your age, your race, and where you going. Touch somebody next to you and say, wow. Wow. That was a wild moment for me, y'all. So being the political person that I am and in the labor movement, that just got my curiosity. So I put my 50 cents in. Ticket came back out and it says, your name is Tony Hill. Say that you're black, right? You're 46 years old and you're going to Jacksonville. Touch somebody else again and say, wow. That's a wild moment for me, y'all. I could not believe it, so I turned around and saw a lady over there with a costume. I went over there and talked to her for a few minutes, persuaded her to let me get the costume and put the costume on, and I went back to the kiosk. Put 50 cents in there again, right? Ticket came back out and said, you still Tony Hill. Right? You still black. You still 46 years old. And while you was over there talking to that woman, you don't miss your damn plane. I just want to let y'all know that I know you know who we are, and we travel from all over, and we just wanted to welcome you to North Florida, and you got a treat on Saturday, y'all, Fort Mosaic. Y'all got a treat. That's where it started at. That's where freedom started. There at Fort Mosaic, I get teared out every time I go over there. You ever heard in the Bible, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground? Yeah. Every time I go over there. And you're going to be hearing, I think, from Diane. Is Representative Clark coming? Where's Diane? She stepped out? He's driving down later today. He's the one that had the vision. And we, members of the Black Caucus, we picked it up from there and we ran with it. And now it's over there, about $5 or $6 million that we invested from the state. Hello? Got it from the state, our taxpayer dollars, and put it up there. But that's where it started at, Fort Mosaic. That's where freedom was. They migrated away, they came by the swamp, as the sister said, they came by the boat and came in there to freedom. And the building is there, and we're steady building on it, and it's just remarkable that I live in Jacksonville, half the people don't even know it's there. It's right around the corner. And so we try to make sure we get kids coming over there to see what people had to go through. And so again, we want to welcome you to North Florida and enjoy your stay. And as they say down home, y'all come back. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to come to you. Just remind me, also in the Florida Senate, we did a concurrent resolution expressing the profound regrets for the involuntary servitude of Africans and calling on the recognition of all Floridians. We did this, I think we were the 7th state to make that apology. All right, and we can get you a copy. We can make some copies. You can take it back with you. But we did that in 2008. So we're trying to do it right here in Florida. We're trying to get it right. We have a little problem with our election, but we're gonna work on that. We're gonna work on that too. We don't want another 2,000. We're gonna work on that. But we did make the apology. Thank you so very much.